welcome to the C Word, the Conservatives podcast. Today we're talking about gap filling. I'm Jen Mathiasson, an Objects Conservative based in South Yorkshire.
I'm Kloe Rumsey, an Objects Conservative based in Greater Manchester.
And I'm Christina, an Objects Conservator based in Cambridgeshire.
Hey, welcome everyone.
Ooh, hello.
Hello.
Yeah, so today we're going to talk about gap filling. So the title of the episode is Mind the Gap, because we're clever.
Aren't we witty?
And I had a slight crisis as I started preparing for this episode, because it's been on the list for a while, because it's a great topic and really relevant to multiple disciplines of conservation, I would say. I started thinking about what is gap filling, and then my lockdown brain went into some sort of crisis mode of, is everything gap filling? Is gap filling the only thing that exists? And it's like, it's not. What are you doing, brain? And it's like, but why do we draw the line? And I just completely spiraled out of control. So maybe someone else should talk about what gap filling is, because now I'm like, it can be so much. But anyway, what is gap filling? Why do we do that?
I don't like the term gap filling.
Oh, excellent.
Oh, we're starting strong.
Or at least when I was a student, I called it gap filling. And then I kind of moved to calling it loss compensation instead, which I think is a broader term and sort of helps you move away from the idea of just filling in holes.
Oh, you know what? That's fantastic. I kind of enjoy that. Strangely strikes me as a kind of academic term that I haven't really seen that much, I was going to say real life, but that's not what I mean. I just meant when talking to people, I feel like no one says loss compensation in a casual conversation. But that doesn't mean that it's not a great term. That's actually really clever. I like that.
Well, maybe it's because I know quite a few paintings conservators, and I'm pretty sure they don't say gap filling.
No,
they say retouching, which is another idea altogether. So I think also there's quite a lot of differences in terminology, but also in concept between the various conservation disciplines. And I think that's one of the issues we've had is we're not necessarily all talking about the same sort of thing.
Yeah, and that was one of the things that I found really interesting. And when I started thinking about this, it was like, oh, we all kind of do it, but we do call it slightly different things, and we do approach it radically differently, depending on what it is that we're trying to achieve. I think loss compensation is good because it's more holistic in terms of what it's trying to say. So for non-conservatives listening, that might be the more understandable phrase in some ways, because it's not always a gap as such. It is about a loss that we are trying to not hide, but then we get into complicated things immediately.
I literally always, whenever I hear the phrase gap filling, I literally always think ceramics. And
exactly.
Yes.
You're putting paste into a thing and you're smoothing it down and it's squidgy, and this is so specific in my head.
Yeah.
And it was only when I was thinking about it for this episode that I was like, well, obviously all the stuff I do with textiles that involves loss compensation, of course that's gap filling, but it's just not squidgy and wet and with ceramics.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because I would say that the top 3 things that I think of when I think gap fill is ceramics, because that's something that I feel like we did try as students. We were very encouraged to try. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing I think of is glass, because often there's almost like an optical illusion thing of you need it to look like the glass and not be distracting and all that stuff. Gap filling glass is horrendous. It's probably lovely. There are probably loads of you out there who are really into it. I'm not. And then furniture conservation involves a lot of that sort of thing as well.
I hadn't thought of that.
Yeah, and that's a really different approach to it as well, because it's all about what you build it up of, and it needs to carry a lot of weight, and we talk about how for a ceramic, it does need to take a certain amount of weight depending on where it is and what kind of ceramic it is and all that stuff, right? But it's not a load-bearing leg.
For the most part, it just needs to feel right.
Well, no, I think sometimes it does. I've done a ceramic sarcophagus.
Oh, what now?
Which was about 7 feet long.
Wow, that's insane.
But that was a massive object where I spent the whole time absolutely shitting myself that the object would literally fall apart if I didn't get the fills right. Sometimes there are large things, and I think in my mind there are sort of 2 reasons really why you might fill gaps or compensate for losses, and one is structural and the other is aesthetic.
Yes. So I wrote down what are our reasons to gap fill, and it basically went with strength, appearance, and possibly functionality, but kind of adjacent to the others in some ways. But then this is all like a Venn diagram, isn't it?
But then is it? I mean, if you're a horological conservator and you're replacing some missing cogs, filling in some of those so that it will work again, is that loss compensation, gap filling, or is that just repair?
No, that's true, because a lot of the things that I was thinking of was like, is this just repair? But is repair just what we would call it if we were talking to like a normal human being? Like is gap filling and loss compensation the words that we use within the profession, and other people would just see it as repair? I don't know, because it is a blurred boundary, and it's
I don't know about that, because I think the public is very aware of restoration as a concept, particularly when it comes to paintings as well. So not just repair, but...
Yeah, that's a good point, actually.
So gap filling or loss compensation is, simply put, adding more material in the process of conservation to affect the appearance.
I mean, yeah, I suppose there's no way...
So it's not, for example, consolidation, because that's supposed to be invisible.
That's a good point, because I was like, well, it's not always aesthetic, but you're right that it always adds something, and that it will always alter something about how it looks, because the whole thing is that it's compensating for a loss, so it will add something in terms of looks.
So it's not meant to be invisible.
Yeah.
It's just that we often think of it as being as subtle as possible, even though you can actually see the physical new material.
Again, this is something that really differs, I would say, across the world. Christina, was it you who told us the amazing story about how ceramics at the British Museum at one point, they were like in-painted in such a way that you couldn't tell that anything had ever been done to them?
Yeah, to wind it back a bit, I'm talking about a collection of vases that I worked on when I was working on the Greek Gallery refurbishment at the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge. And we had a very large collection of these vases that were in the 19th century sent off to be expertly restored using the sort of state-of-the-art techniques that were around at the time. So they sent them off to the British Museum, because that was the place where they knew what they were doing. And in order to get the best possible aesthetic result, they filed down all the breakages. They beveled the edges so that on the outer surface there were kind of V-shaped channels along all the breaks, and then those were filled with plaster. So that's the best way you see to ensure that the breakages match up perfectly, especially at a time when the adhesives were quite thick and gloopy, so you couldn't get very close joins. And then in order to disguise all of this, the whole surface was overpainted very, very heavily. I don't know if you know about attic vases. They're the sort of red and black vases that you think of when you think of Greek pots.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
But there's two types of attic vases, basically, red figure and black figure. And a lot of them have pictures from mythology or pictures of people fighting, war scenes, domestic scenes, all kinds of things. They were highly prized. They were very heavily collected in the 19th century. And this is quite important. They were valued a lot for their aesthetic properties, which I think is one of the reasons why people restored them to such a high degree, was because they were seen as art objects, not just as kind of grubby old archaeological pots, even though obviously they are archaeological. But at some point, sort of maybe 20 years after the Fitzwilliam vases had been restored like this at the British Museum, they decided that they wanted to study the paintings on them more closely. So all of the areas that had paintings on depictions of people, so not just the plain black areas, were then de-restored. And so then, of course, they went from looking absolutely flawless to looking really crappy in comparison. As the conservator working on these objects for redisplay in the galleries in the 21st century, it left us with this real dilemma about what do we do with them.
Yeah.
There are several really interesting stories they can tell. Do we want to emphasise their original archaeological history, if you like, and do what people might have automatically done 30, 40, 50 years ago, which is to try and make them look as they would have done in 300 BC, for example? Or do we want to bring out this really interesting restoration history and what it says about priorities and interests and so on in the 19th century and approaches to restoration? Or do we want to go for some kind of hybrid thing that leaves them looking a bit less awful, but still makes it obvious that they have been broken, and not just broken, but also almost deliberately damaged and repaired multiple times? Or, you know, how do we approach these as objects? Because leaving them as they were is a difficult decision, I think, because it really does damage the aesthetic properties of it, and because they are vases that have pictures on them and it's not just a plain surface, it's something that is representative, then I feel you lose quite a lot when it's damaged in terms of readability of the image.
And that is, of course, one of the things. And I feel like this does very much kind of go into the territory of wall paintings, ceramics, where it does tend to be I feel like it's wrong to say more aesthetic, but it's like, it's all these interesting things. And I've loved talking to ceramics conservators about whether they kind of enjoy doing the kind of really pretty, infilling where it's like you can't tell that it's there, or it's difficult to tell, and then we're coming down to like you can tell when it's up close, but you can't tell from afar, and that seems to have been the kind of aesthetic middle ground, or like the ethical middle ground that we've all kind of gone for as a thing that we accept, is that it can look pretty as long as you can tell up close that it's a later addition. We kind of allow more for that in some things than in others, but as soon as you start kind of broadening the conversation a little bit from maybe calling a gap filling like we've already discussed into something more like loss compensation, then do we blur the lines even further? Because I'm thinking of some of the stuff that is done to like natural history stuff, for example, where it's like you might felt a fur patch to like hide a bald spot that's where it's just been nibbled by pests or something, like, so you can actually look at an animal and not just go funny it's got a bald spot, because that kind of just destroys the entire like experience.
I think that's a really interesting point, and another thing I hadn't thought of because I was so distracted by textiles. Natural history is a really quite emotional one, and I think maybe emotion has quite a lot to do with this, because it's easier to look at a ceramic with loads of bits missing as long as they're sort of supported and they look safe. Mm-hmm. But then if I would try and kind of convince myself that I'd also like to see natural history collections with all of the damage present, I really don't want to see that. I don't want to go to a room full of taxidermy and see all the sorry animals looking bald and like really sad and gross. I think that would be very upsetting, because
that's so interesting.
Not only is it a dead animal, but it's also in a right state. And I know the website Crap Taxidermy is hilarious, but it's also really disturbing and quite upsetting and unsettling. So I was all ready to think this is an academic decision, but actually it has much more to do with emotion.
I hadn't even approached it from that angle, but you're right, that bit is emotional.
What do you think, Christina?
What specifically about taxidermy?
Specifically about the role of emotion in our decision making for gap fills.
I don't know about emotion. I mean, I'm not sure that you can make a clear distinction between emotion and intellectual decisions, if you like, because I think humans have a huge capacity for self-deception anyway, and also a huge capacity for retrospective justification of decisions that they basically want to make anyway, and are going to justify if they can find any way to do it whatsoever. And I think that the role of sort of gut feeling is often underestimated in conservation. But I think that a lot of the time people will know when something looks satisfying or not. And that's not something you can necessarily draw up firm guidelines for, but you can say, yes, this works or this doesn't. And to some extent, that's an aesthetic decision, but I guess it's also partly an emotional decision as well. Does this feel right?
I mean, we did talk about this during our studies as well, but it's something that, every now and then, if you go to like a museum and you're with other people, whether they're museum professionals or regular human beings, then I like having the kind of conversation of, like, if I see like a particular kind of infill or something, then I like having the conversation of, oh, what do you think of that? For example, I love doing it when it's like one that's been left intentionally blank, because I feel like at one point it was quite, maybe not in vogue, but like to leave, say, a ceramic with like a kind of a off-white, but not at all in-painted kind of little fill.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. I don't know what era that is, but that was definitely a thing for a while.
Well, it's kind of 70s, 80s often. They called them neutral gap fills, and it was quite a big thing in archaeological conservation.
Yes, that's a good point, because what I'm thinking of is like big, massive urns that have been, dug up.
Yeah.
And I like having the kind of conversation of, what do you think of that? Like, does that tell you something? How do you respond to that? And you get all sorts of interesting reactions from people, from that's ugly, it's distracting, to I don't really care, to what means that they've done something to it and they wanted us to know that. And I love having those kinds of conversations.
So this is quite similar to the stuff that I spoke to a student called Ellie Sweetnam about. So visible repairs, but disruptive repairs.
Oh.
Hi everyone, today I'm speaking with a student of conservation at Cardiff University who's got a rather interesting attitude to gap filling. Ellie, would you like to introduce yourself and what you've been working on?
Hello, so my name is Ellie Sweetnam and I am a final year master's student in conservation practice, and I came up alongside Jane Henderson with the concept of disruptive conservation, which are visible infills for ceramics.
So how did you become interested in this?
I think it never was a specific point, but almost like an amalgamation of ideas that I've had about perception within museums and with objects. So I studied at Camberwell College of Art for my undergraduate, and it's kind of there that they pushed the concept of questioning things and probing and extending things. So I think it was just a development of conversations that I'd had with people about their thoughts of how things should be perceived. And I think when you're working on something quite physical, a lot of thoughts keep popping up, and it was like, oh, what would happen and how would this be interpreted?
Can you introduce us to the topic of disruptive conservation? Can you describe it for us?
So it's basically a concept. So it's basically exploring authenticity, which is a fundamental concept that conservators always have to deal with, but it has so many different definitions for so many different people and different areas. But I think authenticity is always something that we are striving for, even though it's not one specific tangible thing, really. And I think it's about exploring the fact that conservation isn't neutral, and it shouldn't be neutral, and we shouldn't pretend that it's neutral. When you look at gap fills that are maybe like beige or more true to life, to me that is deceptive to an audience. We have this concept of that, this object is a representation of a time period that doesn't exist anymore. And I think it almost wipes out time passing and different usages, which then changes the authenticity of an object through its life form. And I think when you have a visual, like a gap fill that is visual and is obviously visual, I think it opens so many possibilities to thinking and experiences within a museum.
So we're talking about then ceramics with holes in them that you filled in with something very obvious and something very colourful. Is that right?
Yes. So I've done it with a couple of ceramics before. And I think the thing with disruptive conservation is that it can always be taken, or it can be perceived on so many different levels. Like I think you could go and just have like a pink gap fill. And it's the question of, could a pink gap fill be more honest in representing like interpretation? And does it help viewers get an alignment of the truths that an object has? But then you could almost make it so things would be maybe a little more tonally like changed, I think. So that I think there are levels on how it could be done for an audience as well. It doesn't have to be one specific way of doing something. It's an exploration.
So I'd like to ask you about audience responses a little later on. But first, what do you feel are the benefits of the honest approach, as you say, in telling an object story? How can that be achieved by having visible breakages?
This is actually, strangely, a conversation that I was having with my friend's mother, and we were talking about historic houses, and it also goes back to a paper that I had been reading. She was saying how like in historic houses or in many objects, people love to see that different time periods have happened, and they love to see that change within something because it's history. They visibly see history happening. But then when you have an object, I think in a museum, it puts it in limbo. It's almost like it's frozen. You've frozen something in time. So we're almost stopping history, even though we're trying to explain the lifespan of it. So I think in terms of that way, I think it's a really interesting way of getting maybe visitors to engage in that or start a conversation of why this is happening. But it's also the fact that conservation, I don't think, should be invisible, because it's a lie. You're pretending something. So even in the mending of something is invisible, that's freezing something in time as well, which is something that I just don't agree with. I know that a lot of people might not have the same opinion. Also, I think what's quite interesting to maybe put forward is that I'm not presenting disruptive conservation as everything. I don't think we should do it every single time. But I think if you could have a collection of something and you present it as an alternative, it doesn't have to be the new way of conserving. I don't believe that.
That's really interesting. I really like the idea of it being a choice. And I imagine, so you'd make that choice depending on the object, would you? And depending on the story that it might have.
Yeah, I think, so this I think was your question 4 for me as well, was if it can extend to other areas. And I definitely think it can. I think it's quite easy to do it in terms of textiles. I think visible mending is definitely a concept that's becoming a lot more fashionable now. And
of course.
But there are traditional methods of mending, such as like the Japanese method of like shishiko mending, which actually provides support and stability to areas of damage. But I think we had Janet Berry, who is the head of conservation for the Church of England. She came and she gave us a really, really interesting talk. She was saying how parishioners of churches are actually the ones that have ownership of the church and the objects within it. But I think spirituality is something that you can't really control how people view or how people feel something. So I always think it would be interesting that imagine if parishioners had an old tapestry that was moth-eaten, but they wanted to mend it with gold. Why not allow them to do that? So I think in a way it extends quite easily into some areas of conservation. But for example, I've been conserving some waterlogged stained glass, and I sometimes think, how would I visibly mend these? And you almost can't. It can work in some areas and it can't in others. So it almost becomes like how you would want to present something or work with something, I think.
So this all sounds very good and very emotional. What do you feel are the drawbacks of disruptive and visible conservation?
I sometimes think that it can be questioned about, or it can be perceived maybe as quite arrogant. And as you just said, like be seen as quite emotional. It doesn't always sometimes maybe fit in how people approach conservation, which I think is perfectly understandable and perfectly fine. Like a lot of people I know don't really like to approach things with emotion. I 100% do, I think, as we've all just seen. I sometimes think as well, like it might not be perceived to fit aesthetically within our field. But yeah, I think arrogance might be the number one. Like, what right do we have to be doing this? Are we adding something that maybe shouldn't be added to? Are we creating a storyline that is detracting from the actual storyline of what the object should be saying or could be saying? But also as well, if someone else's understanding of authenticity isn't the same as mine, then it might be completely not ethical to do this process.
So I suppose that's an interesting element to this, isn't it? Because as conservators, we always try to approach things in the most scientific way that we can.
Conservators are definitely seen to be like a very neutral field, like you're not meant to have a bias towards something. And is it our right as conservators to almost add on a storyline? Personally, I don't see it as adding on a storyline. I just see it as making an object a whole form, and it's just a new way of perceiving it. And I think it's like a new way for a museum to provide a narrative.
So this sounds quite curatorial as well. This is sort of edging into the curatorial zone as well, if we're talking about use in museums.
I think it's really interesting how sometimes, not all the time obviously, how conservation and curation are quite separate entities within a museum, and I think it would be really interesting to see what would happen if they were merged and what the outcome of that would be.
So if we're talking about curation and communication of an object's history, I understand this is at the moment quite a sort of theoretical approach that you're taking, but what do you think of the audience response to this approach? Inside or outside of museums?
I think it becomes really, really hard to determine, because you can't ever group an audience into one entity, and they will never go into a heritage space in the same way, and they won't go into it the same. and I don't think their outcomes will be the same. So I think it's really difficult to state what an audience's responses would be. The conversations that I've had with other people so far definitely range from not liking it, and they would prefer a more traditional aesthetic outcome. But then there are others who think it would be really, really interesting to see within a space. So I think I don't really like to say what I think the audience's response would be, because I don't think it would be the same.
That's a really good and probably quite realistic answer. And I suppose this goes back to what we were talking about earlier on, of the sort of expectation of objects and expectation of museums and the stories that that museums are telling.
What I would like, actually, is to hear from people who really dislike it. But I would like to not just hear that they dislike it, but I would like to hear why. Because I think museums are spaces that are seen to hold historical truth, like they're physical entities that hold historical truth. But actually, it's interesting to challenge that, but also to challenge people that see that as truth.
Brilliant. So I think that's a call for responses, really, isn't it? We would like to hear from the listeners, please. What do you think of the idea of visual and disruptive conservation? And I think we'll probably be talking about this as well in the episode. So hopefully we'll drum up some answers for you.
Yeah, I would like to hear them.
Well, thank you so much, Ellie, for your time.
No, thank you for thinking of me.
So I found that really interesting because the photos that I've seen so far are like bright pink or bright blue. So really not just visible, but disruptive, as she says.
It's like a more rebel version of kintsugi, you know, where it's like a deliberately visible mend that like celebrates the break. It is a very deliberate style, and I thought that was really interesting that it draws attention to it and celebrates it. But then like this is like almost like I was going to say like a more punk version of it, because it like Ellie's repairs are very, you know, in your face. We're going to tweet some photos, by the way, for a visual. But yeah, so I kind of felt like it was like a kintsugi parallel in some ways.
I sort of wanted to be either won over or put off completely. But I think I'm both, and I think that's what she was saying, that it's not for everyone and it's not for every time, etc., etc. I found her arguments both for and against quite compelling.
I mean, I like the point that conservators aren't neutral.
Does anybody think they are, though? I mean, maybe this is just because I'm quite old.
Go on.
It just surprised me that was still perceived to be a thing.
Well, I think it's more, I mean, it leans into the perception of museums as being neutral, which is the whole, it's a whole movement now that museums aren't.
Yeah.
I don't often hear people say that about conservators, though, because I feel like, and this again could possibly be the kind of public image that we're trying to portray. Like, we got the lab coat on, we're scientists, we don't do anything naughty, like putting any implied value on things. And it's like,
we want to make things look good. We don't often want to disrupt or sort of shout about ourselves in what we do. Like if our sort of main goal is to make an infill, if secretly, obviously, that we want it to be visible because that's ethical, blah, blah, blah. If our main sort of emotional goal is to make something look so beautifully in keeping that it's impossible to see, then that isn't confrontational. It's not disruptive.
I take issue with the idea that we want it to be visible because that's ethical, actually.
oh, go on.
And I think there are lots of situations in which you might not want it to be visible. And okay, so I mean, this is something that's been talked about for decades in conservation.
Yeah,
is how far you should make your loss compensations visible. And there's been so much debate about this, and there are real quite clear differences in approach depending on the conservation discipline and depending on the type and the age of the object. People approach them quite differently, I think. And so, you know, there's arisen this 6 foot 6 inches rule, which is often talked about, although I kind of feel we ought to metricate it and make it into 2 meters, 20 centimeters or whatever, probably. But
because I live with someone who's into war games, I think of it as painting to tabletop standard. So when it's on the table, it looks fine. But when it's really up close, it's like, yeah, that's not that great.
And that is awesome comparison, because that is exactly getting at why you're doing it.
Yeah.
Which is that it works in the context which it needs to work in.
Yeah.
I mean, obviously, the other ethical issue, if you like, that's not there, I assume, with wargaming and tabletop gaming, is that you need to know what's original and what's not.
Yeah.
But there are ways to paint something mimetically, which is the terminology that's used in paintings conservation, is mimetic retouching. So that's retouching that looks like the original.
Oh, okay.
And is designed to be close to it. People are comfortable with that as long as you can detect what is in painting and what is not, what's original material. And sometimes that might be because different materials are used. And so you can see the differences clearly under a microscope, in UV, all of that kind of thing. Obviously, good documentation is key. But that doesn't mean that the things need to be visible while the object's on display.
Again, it depends on the type of object and the kind of circumstances and stuff like that.
So when I was doing the Greek galleries, I was really struggling with my approach to loss compensation for these objects, partly because they were objects that were valued for their artistic properties. So with Greek vase painting, there are lots of individual painters who have been identified, and there's this whole process of connoisseurship. For example, you might say, well, this is an unsigned vase. Quite a lot of the vases were signed by the painters. This one is unsigned, but I can tell from the style of the brushstrokes and from the way that the feet have been painted that it's been painted by this vase painter. And so it's very, very similar to the sort of thing that we do in easel paintings, where, you know, connoisseurship is really important, partly based on objective and identifiable traits, but also partly based on gut feeling. You know, this just looks like the work of this particular painter.
Yeah.
And that's something that's really unusual in archaeological material. And it sets up this really difficult tension between the kind of archaeological approach that you might take and the more kind of paintings-oriented approach that you might take. Because if connoisseurship is so important to Greek vases and the paintings themselves and the depictions themselves are so important, then it kind of pushes you to want to restore them to a much higher degree than you might do otherwise. Otherwise, there's a whole aspect of the object that's missing. And that's one of the things that the objects have always been valued for historically. If you just put blank fills all over everything, then you're losing a lot more than you would be losing on an ancient Egyptian vase, for example. And so I spent a lot of time talking to paintings conservator colleagues about this, who, by the way, found it absolutely hilarious how crude objects conservators' retouching in painting skills were. And they were like, so you use acrylics? And I was like, yes. Are there other things? And then, you know, they'd reel off a whole list of retouching media that don't exist, basically don't exist at all in objects conservation. It's very interesting. And they've also been trained to a much higher degree in the theory of optics as well, and ways to, and colour matching and the way that the eye perceives things and so on. So they've just got much higher level skills than I had, certainly. And I learnt an awful lot from working with them about thinking about these things. But they've also been having their own conversation in paintings conservation about visible retouching and ways to make fills visible from very close up, but that look really great at sort of display distance.
One of my fondest memories is talking to a paintings conservator and examining a painting in a gallery and, you know, just looking getting really close to the painting and like looking up at it at an angle that's completely unnatural and just seeing the stippling or the like tiny dots that make up the actual, you know, in painted area. And it's just like, oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah, so it can be really, really effective because if you look at it up close, actually it's made of loads of different colours, some of which are not even in the area that you're trying to match the colour to. But from a distance, they blend to create exactly the right effect.
And that's the thing that I've really loved talking to, you know, other types of conservators about. And I mean, I like doing art, but I like doing art and like I like making stuff, but I'm not a very good painter as such. Like I will do a bit of acrylic painting, that's it. I don't know how to do oils or any of that stuff. And I think that's the really beautiful thing about conservation is that we've got such a range of skills and such a range of amazing people. And I mean, also, like, I know that we all joke that paper conservators like everything beige, but the fact that you can get the right kind of beige for a paper fill, I love you people. You are amazing.
This is something they've been talking about for a lot longer in paintings conservation than we have in objects conservation. I think probably because they don't have any choice but to think about how you restore areas where there's no guidance about the original. You know, there's this whole thing that makes objects conservators really squeamish often is, well, how can we do in painting that reconstructs something when we don't even know what it looked like?
Yeah.
And that's something where paintings conservators don't really have that option. They have to do it because for most people, a painting with big holes in it is not acceptable. It massively reduces the value of the painting. Not financial value, but, you know, significance. One thing that we haven't talked about is techniques for gap filling.
It's interesting because I did write down, like I got as far as going, materials, all sorts. Yeah, thanks for that, brain. Mostly because there are so many different types of conservations. There's so many different ways of doing gap filling that it's almost too huge to think about. But I guess we can start with what do we do. Let's maybe start with that, because, you know, we're objects conservators, although we work on very different things, which I, you know, think is cool. Like for me, I've not yet tried to felt a little toupee for someone's butt on taxidermy. I've not done that yet, but I look forward to it. But like I do Japanese tissue infills for, like, you know, webbed feet or wings or, you know, that sort of thing, right? I get the plaster out sometimes and I'll, you know, fill in something on like tiles or ceramics, that sort of thing, right?
When you were talking about the materials choices, were you thinking about the choice between using something sympathetic to the materials that you're filling or completely different to the materials that you're filling for identification reasons?
Both. And also, I suppose, the technique used to do that. So, for example, with ceramics, I've used plaster and I've used the microballoons and B72 kind of mixture. But I've also tried making detachable plaster fills, for example. So I did this in 2003 as a student, and I'm not sure I've ever made detachable plaster fills for a ceramic in an actual job. So that might tell you how I mean, it's basically you just put a separating layer of cling film around the break edges at the point that you're making the fill, so that when the fill is dry you can then pop it out. But it's quite a pain in the ass because you need to kind of temporarily reconstruct the pot. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to get the fill out again because of various sort of undercuts and things like that. So it involves quite a lot more handling and quite a lot more fitting things together. And obviously with ceramics, ideally, you're not going to be putting the break edges together any more than you absolutely have to. What you don't want to be doing is constantly reconstructing it, taking it apart, reconstructing it, taking it apart, and then finally reconstructing it, because you run the risk of abrading the edges and kind of causing more damage. So I wonder how useful it is as a technique anyway, but as a student certainly I had a go at it, and I quite enjoyed the idea that these were things that you could stick them in with B72 and then they would be easy to take out and you wouldn't have plaster kind of embedded in all the edges of your object. Glass is my nemesis. I've never yet made satisfactory fills for glass. It just looks invariably. I am in awe of people who can make nice fills for glass.
I think it depends on the situation a lot. There's still the same kind of a butt join issue, and there's fraying to consider, and you can use things like adhesives. If you're using an adhesive, you can kind of fix the edge so it doesn't fray, that kind of thing. It depends what you're doing. Again, the thing that I'm interested in is the choice between using an organic material that matches what you're filling. So if you're filling a cotton shirt, would you choose cotton? Would you choose silk? Or would you choose polyester? That kind of thing. So I think before I started my job, before I started really studying textiles conservation as a discipline, my impression for textiles and generally organics actually was that one would try to use polyester, like polyester threads, for example, because then it's much, much easier to identify the original and then to identify the conservation. But since I started, I've more kind of realized that actually I much prefer, and it's been demonstrated to me that there's a great benefit in using things like silk for a silk repair because of the softness of the fibres.
Oh, okay.
And the sort of the general qualities of the fibres themselves, or the different materials. So that was just that's just an interesting kind of comparison between the ideal of make it different and the actually in practice. It's really nice to use fine silk thread instead of fine polyester thread.
Well, again, I guess it just depends on, what you're trying to achieve. And sometimes a sympathetic material does need to be quite similar. And I think it does depend.
Can we talk about damage for a bit? So I keep thinking about the removal of the appearance of damage, the origin of the damage for different objects, and how it makes me feel to remove the evidence of that damage.
Ooh.
Because where I'm coming from is, this is what some of the visible conservation stuff has got me thinking about. So when I'm working with my huge banners, a lot of the old ones are damaged because of their use. So they are, we've got hundreds in our collection that are like in a pretty terrible state at the top, and then mostly missing or literal rags at the bottom. And they are in that situation for the most part because they were buffeted around in the wind and they were taken on marches, and they're like silk and giant amounts of, huge heavy bits of oil paint and all of that. And there are fantastic photographs of essential rags still being taken out by the members of the union because it was their banner, even though you could barely make out any of the banner. So some of those have been conserved in the traditional way of you use your blank, well-matched infill silk. If you need to do in painting, you do it in a blank kind of way. You use various different types of methods, blah, blah, blah. But there are some that have been infilled or just supported with just net.
Yeah.
For example, or just a single layer of the silk crepeline, which is really thin, and you can see all of the rags still. You can see each of the raggedy bits, I hate using that word, but it's so descriptive, have been stitched on so that you can still see all the gaps and you can still see all the holes and you can still see the tears and everything. And I can't help but like that approach better, even though in some ways it's not as strong. So it technically, maybe it's not as holding it as strongly as if you had a backing of something else. But I prefer to see the damage. I prefer to see the sort of the fact that it's been whipped around in the wind and all of that. And so I do think there is quite a lot of the origin of damage that is quite, I know this isn't a groundbreaking opinion, but at what point does one say that the history of something is stopped? If a vase was pushed off a table, does it matter who pushed it off? Does it matter when it pushed it off? When they pushed it off? It could be an archaeologically.
Was it the cat or was it a vandal?
Yeah, exactly. It might be in this, it might be an important vase owned by an important person and made by an important person. But if it was pushed off a table in an important argument or by an important cat or something, do you want to take away the evidence of that damage?
Yeah, and that's another interesting thing. I mean, so there it's not, I suppose it's stabilization rather than loss compensation in some ways. And yeah, that obviously that's a completely valid approach, and for some things that is the approach to take. I do feel like that might be almost more true for things that have great political significance or like a lot of emotional impact, perhaps. I think it depends on what it adds to the object.
I was thinking...
Not all loss takes away, which sounds weird.
Oh, yeah, that's true. That's true. And I'd be interested to hear Christina's opinion on that in terms of paintings. I quite like seeing paintings with fold lines and creases and cracks that have been conserved, but you can still see the underlying canvas, or the whatever it is that's been lost has remained lost. For example, the Bronte portrait. That's still got all of the fold lines from when it was folded up and stuck in an attic or whatever.
Oh, interesting.
And I actually really like that because it demonstrates that it has gone through various periods of time. It was, enjoyed and then disposed of almost. I don't know the history. I'm just going to say I don't know the history about that. I just have vague memories.
I think, doesn't it come down to which stories you want to tell about the objects again. I mean, objects have kind of multiple lives and are capable of multiple interpretations, and this is one of the big dilemmas for conservators, is how you choose which of those to bring out at any one time. I guess you were talking about fold lines and so on in paintings. I guess that's where your kind of gut feeling comes in, isn't it? Because there is a point at which something is so damaged that then you can't read it as an image. And then that becomes really difficult. And I think part of this is to do with cultural expectations. So again, talking to paintings conservators, one of them has done a lot of panel paintings. And so these tend to be medieval, much, much earlier than the sort of oil paintings on canvas that are what you think of when you think about paintings conservators restoring things. And she said people are much happier to accept big visible losses in medieval panel paintings than they are in a 19th century oil painting, even though a lot of oil paintings are actually really, really damaged. And I think a lot of people would be surprised at just how extensive the losses are to the painted surface on a lot of oil paintings. Once, if you ever see any of these things in progress, they're often quite large areas that are being retouched by the conservator. It's not just the odd crack here and there. Sometimes it'll be kind of quite big gaps. And I think this is partly that we're willing to tolerate things looking more broken and more damaged and so on if it's a particular type of object. So if it's not an art object as much, if it starts to be seen as more historical or archaeological, but also just if it's older.
One of the questions I was going to put to you was, when do we want to see repairs and when do we want to see decay, essentially? Like, not necessarily active decay, maybe arrested decay is a good way of putting it, because, you know, a lot of conservation is finding a point to pause at. And, you know, it's like, how much of a patina are we going to have on this statue? Like, how shiny do you want this thing? Because actually, you know, it oxidized. Or where do you take it to and where do you stop? And it's the same with loss compensation. I just love these conversations. It's so good. And I would love to see more museums have these conversations about things like Ellie's infills and, you know, stuff like that. Like, can damage be beautiful, or do we like damage sometimes? Actually, I really enjoyed the point about like making appropriately chosen blah blah infill really obvious kind of highlights the work of conservators. Like, here it is, this is what we do sometimes, and then you may not see this in a lot of them because we do it differently in them, but this is part of the unseen work that you can see here temporarily. I mean, I'm sure someone out there must have done like a cool display where it's like, or I hope someone has, where someone has like maybe a dark room and there's like a lit up object and it's a ceramic, and then you give everyone goggles, and once every 15 minutes you turn on UV lamps or something, and then you can see all the restoration work. That would be amazing. I hope someone's done that, and if you haven't, you should. Free idea. Health and safety though. But like, I would love to see that kind of thing, right, where it's like, look, there's a lot of work that goes on that you cannot see.
I think it's really interesting the difference between choosing not to act, so allowing the damage to be visible by not acting. So, for example, by not adding, you know, the textile infill to the raggedy area of the banner that I was talking about. Choosing not to do that versus doing exactly the same level of work, but adding a disruptive colour. So doing your conservation, but making it
a neon netting.
Yeah. Oh God, don't. That makes it... And my stomach literally just went, oh God, neon.
Okay, I took it too far. Far.
See, and why is it that I react like that to textiles to make like actually disruptive textiles fills, but when it's ceramics, I'm like, yeah, okay, well, you know.
Well, I mean, Ellie did make a good point about, you know, like visible mending and stuff like that. That's like a really big thing now, you know, like people are, you know, making do and mending, and they're making, you know, clothes repairs and all sorts of stuff, you know, really visible. They are a point to look at. It's supposed to draw the eye. It's supposed to add something to the item. And I mean, it's interesting that we don't ever see it like that in conservation. Although, I mean, as soon as I see like one of these massive flags that's been very carefully stitched onto a backing and beautifully framed and everything, I love standing there and just looking at all the stitches. But you know, I'm just saying there can be an enjoyment in seeing a repair as well. Like I think there can be a level of something being oddly satisfying, you know. But maybe that's just because we're damaged people, because we're conservators. Today I'm reviewing Pottery and Porcelain Restoration, A Practical Guide by Roger Hawkins. This is a 2020 Crowwood Press publication, and I'm reading the ebook version, but it's also available in traditional paperback. The book is divided into 14 chapters, plus an appendix and some useful bits like a glossary at the end. The introduction addresses some of the history and public image associated with ceramics conservation, and features the most Mad Max teapot I've ever seen, while recognizing the enormous diversity of skills, techniques, and materials in the field. It's a refreshing introduction that's honest and grounded in a mixture of experience and professional metacognition. I don't usually care for intros, but this one's actually quite good. The first chapter is the primer in what we mean by terms such as pottery and porcelain. It has a whiff of back to school about it, but it's laced with trivia in a way that keeps it really interesting. I mean, material science is plenty interesting, but I'm only ever so enthused about frit and oxides. I've got to say though, this chapter is comprehensive and ideal for how to do a visual ID of almost any ceramic type, and that's an absolute delight to see. The images in this book are so nice, and I kind of wish I'd had this on hand years ago. By the way, each chapter is an absolute visual feast, so even the ones I'm not specifically telling you about are richly illustrated and contain some excellent information. Roger hasn't stinged. Chapter 3 is all about the tools and materials that Roger finds most useful in his professional life as a restorer, and this is my favourite part of the whole book. It's so rare to hear seasoned conservators share their secrets, for lack of a better word, of what they use and even how they recommend setting up their workspace. It just fills me with joy. It's a practical, relatively thrifty, and very honest guide to setting up a studio space, and it's written in a really approachable way. It's not preachy or prescriptive, but it is solid advice. There's also no implied pressure to do ceramics restoration professionally. This advice is just as applicable to any happy amateur doing this as a fulfilling hobby. The chapters on examination, taking things apart, and reassembly are all wonderfully practical and an absolute godsend if you, like me, work alone and generally have to figure stuff out on your own and on a budget. This is in contrast to, large institutions with dedicated ceramic specialists and more money for equipment, for example. As someone who occasionally has to brush up on how to deal with pottery, as I deal with a wide variety of materials in a really mixed collection, this is a handy guide to have on hand. It's stuff I already know, but it's a refresher written for and by human beings, and you know what? That doesn't go amiss. I wish more types of conservation had this sort of handbook. Since this is going in our gap fill episode, I should of course point out that yes, there is a chapter on fills. In fact, there are two. One on small ones and one on more substantial missing sections. They're as practical and straightforward as the rest of the book, and of particular use to me is another chapter which is about colour matching, something I definitely need to practice. I'd like to give an extra little shout out to the appendix on starting your own business. It's a quick and dirty guide, to be sure, but again a welcome taster for anyone who's thinking about doing this as a job for themselves. In summary, I have to say that I like this book a great deal, and I'd like to own a hard copy of it myself one day. It's a friendly, updated version of the kinds of ceramic repair handbooks that I've generally seen around, but that are a little bit out of date now. This is a book that I could have done with as a student, or an emerging professional for that matter. It may possibly annoy ceramics conservators a bit, as it's... it could be seen as, sharing trade secrets or something. Not really. It's just, common sense written down. But I can see how it might not be for everyone. This is a generalist kind of book. It's for someone who'd like to get into ceramics conservation or restoration. And as such, it isn't for someone who's already proficient in that. It's a beginner's book, and that's a good thing. It's absolute gold for anyone who doesn't have a ceramic specialist tutor on hand and is eager to learn. This book has 160 pages, full colour illustrations throughout, and is available for purchase on Amazon for around £25.
Dear Jane, when I was a conservation student, my entire class were white. We were, for the most part, white and middle class. Different elements of our upbringing impacted on our interests, which in turn led to an interest in conservation. We talk about wanting to diversify conservation, but I wonder, as a university professor, what stage do you think we need to be reaching out to non-white students to encourage them to come into conservation? Do we write to MPs to encourage more art in primary schools? Do we go and talk to more diverse high schools? This is a huge question, probably one which should be answered by more questions, but I'd love your thoughts from years of reading applications about student motivations. Dear Anonymous, well, what a brilliant question. And I'm glad you let me off with there's probably more questions than answers. In terms of the conservation classes that I'm involved in teaching, largely they're not entirely white. But there's no question that conservation is a generally white and middle class profession, as Jenny and Kloe have talked about. There is some diversity in terms of issues like disabilities and neurodiversity, but in terms of other areas, a lot less diversity. I think it's interesting to talk about how we led to having an interest in conservation. And certainly, I can't think of any reason why, when you're doing your outreach work for conservation, you wouldn't reach out to a good range of school students where you are and even a little bit further away from where you are. I think that you should prioritize any groups of kids who don't have the normal cultural access to the arts and the platforms to get in, because that cultural capital, that ambition for education and to have interesting and diverse jobs, that's a fire that, anyone can help light. I also think that reaching out as a conservator to school students doesn't have to lead to a career in conservation. I hope it encourages people simply to live their dreams, to imagine that they can be the person they want, to understand that the world isn't just people who get jobs as teachers and perhaps as garage mechanics. And I don't mean that rudely. I mean it in the sense of when I was at school, there was an incredibly narrow range of jobs that were ever put in front of me as options. And I think by going out as conservators and doing advocacy at school levels, we can improve people's horizons. However, you asked about non-white students and primary schools. I'm a little bit reluctant to start saying that the issue here is that Black students of colour or BAME students, depending on how you phrase it, and in different countries we use different terminology. But I'm a little bit reluctant to say that some students need to apply, that we need to sort of fix those people who are not applying, because that's never ever the answer, is it? We kind of know that. The problem is always our problem. If we are overly white and middle class, we need to fix ourselves and to deal with and to challenge the infrastructure that has created that situation. Some of the infrastructure that I think creates is to do with pre-course requisites, the requirement to have done so many hours of volunteering. And it's one of the reasons why the course that I influence, I take a stand against making any requirement. I require people to demonstrate an enthusiasm and an interest in the sector, but never to have spent hours, because I see that as a hugely burdensome and discriminatory practice in terms of the income. I think that all of us as conservators can learn to communicate and write about our topics in an inspirational way, and that will diversify the audience of people who come in. I think we can look at simple but important messages and triggers that we put out by ourselves, and we should challenge ourselves. What are the images of conservators that we put out there? When you look at marketing materials for the sector bodies, for your organizations, whose faces can you see? Who are we representing? That's something we need to do better on, I would say, because if you don't see yourself in the career, why would you ever start it? Another barrier, I think, to conservation careers is the finance of a conservation career. The assumption that you will do 1 or 2 degrees, then possibly volunteer for another year or work in a rotten salary, moving house for another couple of years. And even then, at the end of it all, with the masses of student debt, is a job where they're expecting to live off not very much more above minimum wage. So I think that is a huge barrier to people who don't have financial reserves, people for whom your family seriously need you to earn money and be independent and contribute to the family, which again is not necessarily entirely a racial issue, but in any society where systematic racial discrimination exists, which is pretty much all of them, then this is always going to weed out families who have greater poverty. And when poverty is one of the many prices we pay for racism, then this is clearly going to be discriminatory. I'm not sure that I want to write to an MP to encourage more arts in primary school, although I might do that as a person in the same way that I would do it to encourage visits and music. I'm not sure that that's specifically an issue for the conservation profession, but perhaps you could come back and tell me why you think that's wrong. But I think realistically, it's about making our profession more open to a range of students. And honestly, I think we have to tackle some of the less acceptable sides of the volunteering intern culture, where people are expected to work without money or to work in expensive places for salaries that do not cover your living cost. The last thing I need to address, and it's not by any means the last thing that on this topic, is that you asked about applications and student motivations. Interestingly, the student application forms these days are becoming more and more formalised and processed by people in admissions. But we still often get a chance to see applications because students coming into conservation are just so diverse. And people in the Office for Admissions can't really deal with conservatives because they look at these amazingly eclectic careers that we have and just don't recognise us in their normal academic ways. So I do still see a lot of application statements. I've been thinking back, and I think, you don't know from an application whether a student is a person of colour or a Black and minority ethnic student. You can't tell that. There's clues and hints. I think, and I haven't checked because I don't know, I could check, but I think I can only remember students referring to their heritage in a sense that would be a heritage of a person of colour, has been Black and minority ethnic students or students of colour. And 2 or 3 students have mentioned that as a reason why they want to move into conservation, as a point of personal pride, that they feel they want to represent their communities and to act to represent and to protect specific communities and collections. And I can only say from my perspective, that's a strength in an application. I was concerned, you can tell from my icon, that I'm a white, I'm a professor, so that counts me as a middle class conservator. So I have asked another voice to speak, not because I want to offload the work or the responsibility, but because I think on questions like this, we can't simply centre white voices. That doesn't mean that the white conservators don't have the responsibility for making our profession as diverse and as welcoming as we possibly can. And that does mean changing some big things, challenging some big topics about the setup and the presumptions of conservation. When I'm not being the C-words agony aunt, I've been thinking more and more about how conservation has been used as a justification for colonial practices. And I'm quite concerned about that sense that if we don't challenge it, then we accept it. Because, white Western museums don't get to keep things because we look after them better. Because burning someone's house down and stealing their things is never looking after things better. Stripping things from their community is never looking after things better. Taking away all the context and meaning for things by removing them from the people for whom they are important, vital, symbolic or meaningful, and taking them away from those places, that is never how we look after collections. So I think as a conservation community, we have to work hard to distance ourselves from past practices. That is my personal opinion and one I've been trying to write about in my works. So I'm going to leave it there, and I hope that I'm able to also hear from Nerys, who I also passed this question to. Thank you for the question. Thank you for the challenge and provocation that was inherent in it.
Your memories are short and you haven't been listening. Belly Magina, Lewis Johnson, Christopher Capesa, Christopher Alder, Stephen Lawrence. When faced with these monumental times, many of you have asked the victims, what can we do? I have suggestions. Number 1, educate your own damn selves. No oppressed person owes you the emotional onus of explaining the history of their exploitation and trauma. You are demanding their free labour. It is literally at your fingertips. Google it, Bing it, DuckDuckGo it. Take the responsibility to educate yourself. Number 2, investigate yourself and your institution. Every context is different, And the hard work of determining your own racist complicity is a complex matter. And it is your duty. It has to be difficult. If it's not tough, if it doesn't make you uncomfortable, you're not doing it right. Do the work. Number 3, know that as soon as you inform yourself and decide to actively support basic human rights for all, you become a part of the solution, no matter your past actions. Number 4, claiming allyship to Black Lives Matter. Statements are like bread, lovely when fresh, but stale within a day. MOUs are far more meaningful. What binding social contracts will you and your policymakers adhere to now, today, to keep you accountable in the future? This is by far the most important. Otherwise, your actions are just another round of bandwagoning, performative, and empty gestures, whilst people that look like me and my family continue to be murdered, sidelined, and fail to flourish. Do better.
As usual, we welcome your comments, questions, and corrections on the show. This time I'd just like to add a quick thing from Christina. We have linked in the show notes for this episode to a couple of articles about the work that she's been talking about, but they are behind a paywall. If you have trouble accessing any of them, do get in touch with Christina and she might be able to hook you up with a PDF. Hope that helps. Feel free to get in touch with us. We love hearing from you.
Hi, and welcome back to the Benchwork Bar. I'm Amanda Richards, your bartender today, and today we're going to be making the pulp fill. So, what we're going to need first is 2.5 ounces of bourbon. There we go. Today I'm using Bib & Tucker's. It's a new favorite of mine. Alright, so 2.5 ounces into a shaker with ice. So, into the measuring cup. There we go. And then 1 ounce of fresh orange juice. And 1/2 ounce of lemon juice, freshly squeezed. And 1/2 ounce of the smoked herb simple syrup. Then a dash of orange bitters. And we'll go ahead and shake it for 30 seconds, just until the whole shaker is frosty. Once it is fully shaken, then you're pour the whole thing into a prepared glass with a sprig of rosemary, a cherry, and a slice of orange. All right, and that is the pulp fill. For our mocktail version, we're going to start with 4 ounces of orange juice, freshly squeezed, 2, and 4, 1/2 ounce of freshly squeezed lemon juice, and 1/2 ounce of smoked herb simple syrup. Then on top of ice in your shaker, shake it again for 30 seconds. And again, we'll just pour this straight from the shaker into your glass, garnish it with rosemary, a cherry, and your orange slice. And there you have it, the pulp fill and the mocktail. I hope you enjoy.
If you're enjoying the C Word and would like to support our work, then please consider becoming one of our patrons. For as little as $1 per month, you can help us keep our episodes online and more of them coming. Patreon helps us meet our regular costs for the show, and also to plan ahead so we know roughly how much of a monthly budget we've got. That's super helpful when you're trying to do something special like buy a better microphone or save up to go to a special event. Your support also helps keep us free of advertisement. In return, our supporters get access to our archive of extended episodes, which you can only access on our Patreon page. Yeah, for that $1 a month, you get a little extra audio enjoyment. We've crunched the numbers, and it's about 10% extra content on a regular basis. Well, that's not bad for less than a cup of coffee, eh? If supporting us sounds like something you'd like to do, then head over to patreon.com/thecword and join our bunch of absolute champions. Thanks for listening. We're The C Word, and you'll be listening to Kloe, Rumsey, Christina, Rozeik, and me, Jenny Mathiasson. Join us next time for an episode about light. In the meantime, check out our website at thecword.show, tweet us at thecwordpodcast, or simply email us on thecwordpodcast@gmail.com. The intro and outro music is Spring by Didi Missick, used under Creative Commons Attribution License. Additional music and sound effects by Callum Robertson. This has been a Wooden Dice production.
But I'm glad to hear, Christina, you advised me to use epoxy and glass microballoons, because that's what I was thinking as well, for the reasons that you outlined.
No, I advised you to put it in the bin.
I mean...